Hello and welcome back to the Usage Report. I'm your host, Josh Shepardson, and you can follow me on Twitter where I post this at BChat50. And this week I'm going to be looking at 4 running back situations and 4 passing situations around the league that have some shakeups in terms of playing time, or at least have some interesting tidbits worth exploring. And jumping right into things is one situation that's getting a lot of attention, and that's the Green Bay Packers backfield. James Starks played 55 offensive snaps compared to Eddie Lacy's 19, doubled him up in carries with 10 compared to Lacy's 5, and almost quadrupled him up in yardage with 39 rushing yards compared to 10. And Starks, the far more competent pass-catching back, with 6 receptions on 8 targets, and Lacy was targeted just 1 time, and he failed to reel in that target. Lacy's been one of the biggest first-round busts of the season, and while the offensive coordinator and the club continue to talk about how they need to get him in the game mix and get him going, at this point, I mean, I'd say it's pretty wishful thinking to expect him to get going at all. He looks out of shape. He looks slow. He has no wiggle. He has no burst. Starks has looked the part of the better back, and Starks overtook him for the rushing yardage lead for the Packers with his 39 yards rushing this past week. So Starks, the better back. If you own both, Starks is the one to start. He has some flex appeal this week against the Detroit Lions, Packers' biggest betting favorites of the week at minus 11 points, according to Pinnacle Sports. So there is going to be that potential for Starks to get some work. Lacy reportedly suffered a groin sprain in the contest against the Panthers, but he's practicing, not going to miss any time. Doesn't matter what the reasoning is for Lacy looking terrible this year. He hasn't been good at all. And whether that's injury related or just ineffectiveness, Starks has been the better back. And at this point, Starks needs to be universally owned because Packers have lost a couple games in a row, and it's pretty easy to see where they can make a sizable offensive upgrade, and that's continuing to turn to James Starks in favor of Eddie Lacy, who's just been awful this year. Next up was a surprising backfield situation, and that's of the San Francisco 49ers. Was not really much of a committee situation at all, with Shaun Draughn playing 44 of the offensive snaps, Kendall Gaskins playing 16, and the since cut Pierre Thomas playing 4, with Thomas out of town. It's Drones and Gaskins filling in for Carlos Hyde should he miss any more time. And very clearly, Drone is the back to own. 16 carries compared to 7 for Gaskins. 58 rushing yards compared to 20 for Gaskins, and was utilized in the passing game with 5 targets for 4 that resulted in 4 receptions. So not the most exciting player, and we're talking about a running back that is going to be in a Blaine Gabbert-led offense. So pardon me for not being too excited about anyone tied to a Blaine Gabbert-led offense, but fact is, there are a number of injuries that have been suffered by running backs, and the position has just been crippled by these injuries. So the Niners are on bye this week. If you have a low-end waiver claim or just want to throw a few dollars at somebody from your fat budget to try and round out your bench, get some running back depth, Shaun Draughn is the back to do that with in the 49ers backfield at this point. But Carlos Hyde remains week to week at this point. It's possible he could play coming out of the bye, but the fact that the Niners are out of it, the fact that he's should be considered a part of their future, I wouldn't expect them to push him if his foot's bothering him. So, but Shaun Draughn is clearly the, I guess you could call him a handcuff to Carlos Hyde, but the back to own if Hyde misses more time. But again, if you have a high waiver priority, Draughn isn't the type of player that warrants that type of investment. Next up is the backfield situation for the Tennessee Titans. Antonio Andrews played off 45 offensive snaps. Dexter McCluster played 29. McCluster remains the pass-catching complement to Antonio Andrews, with Andrews carrying the ball 19 times for 88 yards. McCluster 8 for 19, but McCluster getting 4 targets and 2 receptions compared to 2 targets and 1 reception for Antonio Andrews. David Cobb was expected to possibly be back for Week 9's contest, but he was reportedly out of shape and not ready to go. So the team did not activate him from injured reserve with that designation to return. The expectation is that Cobb will be back this week, but since he's got some rust to shake off, since we've also had reports that he's out of shape, I would expect him to take on a large role in that backfield just yet. Might as the season wears on, was a guy that I featured a couple of weeks ago as a buy low candidate, and a guy that I discussed in this podcast and article when looking at the mess that was this backfield. But Andrews has actually outperformed my expectations, and at this point, he needs to be owned in all 12-team leagues or larger. Understanding that David Cobb could carve out a substantial role here in the next few weeks, but Andrews going to have a chance probably this week at least to extend his leash with another good performance. Moving on to the pass catching side of things, the Buffalo Bills squashed the fish, as they say. They squished the fish, as they say. And while Robert Woods played the most snaps of any of the receivers, playing 50, he was targeted just one time, had 0 receptions with that one target. Sammy Watkins was the man in the passing game. Tyrod Taylor threw 12 passes. 8 of them were directed at Sammy Watkins. Watkins reeled in all 8 of those passes for 168 yards receiving and a touchdown. Charles Clay was a forgotten man. 1 target, 1 reception, 6 yards. Did play 52 offensive snaps, so there's nothing in terms of injury to be worried about there. But the squeaky wheel got the grease, so to speak. Watkins was vocal earlier in the season about wanting to get the football more. Did get the football more in that contest against, I believe it was the Titans that he first started complaining. Exited with a injury on a touchdown grab. Has missed some time, but in his first contest back, looked the part of a number 1 receiver. Was very a real life number 1 receiver. Not quite. I mean, he certainly looked the part of a fantasy number 1 receiver with 168 yards receiving a touchdown. But I wouldn't expect him to continue to post number 1 receiver numbers, but number 2 receiver numbers are very much within reach since he and Tyrod Taylor seem to be on the same page. Taylor has been very efficient, 11 of 12 passing this past week, completing over 70% of his passes on the season. Doesn't seem to be overwhelmed by the situation, by the fact that he is a first-year starter, though part of that's probably because he's a veteran and he's been around the league for a while. So Watkins' stock is way up. Clay's stock is down a bit with just the 1 target, but I do expect Clay to get some more targets in the coming weeks, have some decent games down the stretch, and he's a fringe starter at this point, probably around a top 10 tight end. But the fact that Watkins carved out such a substantial role this week does limit the upside of Clay if that's going to continue to be the case. Next up, we're going to look at the Green Bay Packers passing situation. We looked at their running back situation. The passing situation is a little bit more exciting. If you didn't heed my advice and move James Jones a few weeks ago, you are stuck with him. And I put the air quotes around that because Jones does have value. That's not to say that he's a guy that is worthless and you're stuck eating him, but he is a boom or bust touchdown-dependent receiver. And I think that there was a window to sell him as a little bit more reliable than that. But not the worst thing if you still hold him on your rosters. But this week pretty much exemplified what could happen if Jones isn't catching touchdown passes. Just 2 receptions for 57 yards. His 6 targets were behind both Randall Cobb and Davante Adams at receiver, but also behind Richard Rodgers' 9 targets at tight end. So Jones, not necessarily going to be a big volume guy. Going to need touchdowns to hold value. The promising number here is Davante. The more positive, I should say, player to discuss here is Davante Adams, who turned in his best game of the season with 11 targets. It resulted in 7 receptions for 93 yards. Randall Cobb, still the most productive receiver on that team, 4 grabs for 99 yards and a touchdown, also the most targeted with 12. And Richard Rodgers showed off his red zone prowess with a couple of touchdown grabs. 19 yards, certainly nothing to write home about on 5 receptions, so sub 4 yards per reception is kind of crazy. But he is clearly a red zone threat, and if you are hurting at tight end, if you need a bye-week fill-in sort of deal, Richard Rodgers has clearly established himself as one of Aaron Rodgers' favorite targets when the Packers get near that goal line. Next up is the San Diego Chargers, who were dealt another blow this week. Malcolm Floyd suffered what's reportedly a torn labrum in his shoulder, probably going to be out for the year, and that means next man up. Stevie Johnson is the clear-cut #1 receiver there. The clear-cut #1 pass catcher, though, is probably going to be Antonio Gates, and running back Danny Woodhead also gets the nod as a guy who's going to move up in the pecking order, but guys like Ladarius Green and Dontrell Inman also could have some value as emergency Hail Mary types in leagues down the stretch, just because this team throws the football so much. Nobody's attempted more passes this year than Phillip Rivers, and Melvin Gordon continues to be his own worst enemy, not showcasing anything as a runner this year. And that means if they continue to air it out, some of these third and fourth pieces in the passing game are going to probably have an emergent game or two down the stretch. Predicting those is going to be difficult. The guys to really own are Stevie Johnson, Antonio Gates, and Danny Woodhead. But if you're hurting and you really just need to fill your flex with somebody that might have some opportunities, a guy like Dontrell Inman or Ladarius Green look the part just because of how this offense is geared up to air it out so frequently. Next up is the Tennessee Titans, and like the Packers, featured their backfield, also going to feature their pass catchers. No Kendall Wright this past week. Harry Douglas did play a prominent role, and he's missed time this year. He totaled the most snaps, 59 offensively, caught all 5 of his targets, total 73 yards receiving. Pretty good day for him. But Dorial Green-Beckham is the guy, excuse me, in terms of receivers, who had the most noteworthy performance with 10 targets that resulted in 5 receptions for 77 yards receiving. He's going to be a boomer bust guy down the stretch, but he's a physical freak. And the fact that Marcus Mariota targeted him 10 times is promising for his upside. He's a big target, so red zone looks should come his way down the stretch. And the other guy to note here is Delanie Walker, the tight end. Caught 7 of his 8 targets for 95 yards and a pair of touchdowns, one of which was a very fluky 61-yard touchdown reception on a ball that should have been picked off by one of 2 Saints players, but those 2 Saints players collided, and it was basically bad news bears out there, with the ball getting deflected to Delanie Walker, Walker reeling it in and sprinting to the end zone. So Walker is the top pass-catching option as long as Kendall Wright is out. Not sure how much time Wright is going to miss, but Walker, the favorite target in that passing attack, and very good option at tight end. Probably going to be a starter almost week in and week out the rest of the season, especially with Kendall Wright out. But Dorial Green-Beckham and Harry Douglas stepping up as some viable possible flexes down the stretch. And of the 2, I like Green-Beckham because I'd rather chase the ceiling there. Douglas doesn't have quite the ceiling, and the uptick in floor just isn't worth the downgrade in ceiling. Finally, we're going to look at the Washington Redskins, which they certainly aired it out frequently last week, playing catch-up against the New England Patriots, and they did so with their full complement of receivers, and we really haven't seen that much this year. Jamison Crowder was actually the man who led the receivers in offensive snaps with 55. He was trailed ever so slightly by Pierre Garçon's 51 and Deshaun Jackson's 49. And then tight end Jordan Reed played 43 snaps as well. The targets were super tightly clustered. 8 targets for Crowder, 8 for Garçon, 6 for Jackson, 7 for Reed. Receptions fairly tightly clustered, but not surprisingly, the slot receiver Jamison Crowder reeled in the bulk of his targets with 6 receptions. Garçon had 4, Jackson 3, and Reed 3. Your leader in receiving yards was Pierre Garçon with 70. Jackson laid a clunker with 15 receiving yards. Ditto for Jordan Reed, but Reed saved the day with his touchdown grab, making up for just the 18 yards receiving. Crowder, not a big play threat, catching a lot of short passes as a slot guy. Total just 50 yards, no touchdowns. He's an undersized guy. Going to have some modest appeal in PPR leagues just because he should reel in some receptions. I hate to put a comp on him in terms of fantasy value, but kind of reminds me of Devon Best from a few years ago, where probably not going to get any big performances, but this 6 for 50 is well within reach. And if you're scrambling to deal with injuries, getting to that double-digit point scoring threshold, the 11 points, certainly counts for something. Garçon and Jackson both have big playability, but both are not the most consistent. And Jordan Reed, it has been the most consistent pass catcher, does have a track record of injuries, so always have to keep that in mind with him. But all hands on deck this week against the hapless pass defense of the New Orleans Saints. I have no idea what Rob Ryan is doing there. I don't think Rob Ryan knows what Rob Ryan is doing there. They were torched this past week by Marcus Mariota. They were torched 2 weeks ago by Eli Manning. They have no answers for anyone in the passing game. That makes all of these guys high ceiling plays this week. Even a guy like Jamison Crowder, who I mentioned, probably not much of a touchdown threat, but if this team can get it going through the air, could reel in a few more passes than usual. Jordan Reed is the top guy to have in that game, as the Saints are the worst defense in football, ceding the most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends per Pro Football Reference. And Garcon and Jackson, certainly both capable of getting behind that secondary and abusing some of the cornerbacks there in New Orleans. And on that note, that's going to wrap things up. Check out fantasyfootballcafe.com for some great articles, podcasts such as this one, and the very active forums where you've got a very knowledgeable fantasy football community chatting pretty much around the clock, asking questions, and just discussing fantasy football strategy, player news, and all of the above. So check that out. Good luck this week, and check back next week.